blood, and terror. These were the twin forces that shaped medieval execution methods, casting a dark veil over the law and order of a world both brutal and unyielding. In the shadowed streets and open squares of medieval Europe, justice was dispensed not merely as a matter of law, but as a spectacle of power, pain, and control. The instruments of death were wielded with a calculated cruelty, their purpose extending far beyond the mere ending of life. They became the somber language through which authority spoke to its subjects, a grim testament to the consequences of transgression and defiance. The medieval period was an era defined by stark contrasts. The devout piety of the church intertwined with savage feudal rivalries, the fragile peace maintained by powerful lords overshadowed by the ever-present threat of rebellion and crime. Within this volatile social and political climate, executions emerged as both a practical necessity and a symbolic performance. They were designed to instill fear, exact retribution, and reinforce the hierarchies that governed society. To witness an execution was to confront the raw edge of authority, a moment when the veneer of civilization slipped away, exposing the merciless machinery of justice beneath. Feudalism, the dominant social structure, entrenched hierarchies where power was concentrated in the hands of a few. Lords exercised near absolute control over their domains, dispensing justice as they saw fit. The law was an extension of their will, and the executioner their grim enforcer. In tandem, the Church wielded spiritual authority, its doctrines shaping the moral framework within which justice operated. Sin and crime were often indistinguishable, and the punishment meted out was as much a penance for the soul as a penalty for the body. Heresy, witchcraft, and blasphemy became crimes not only against man, but against God, justifying the harshest of penalties. Public executions were the theater in which these forces collided. The condemned body became a canvas of suffering and public spectacle, a visceral lesson etched into the collective memory of the populace. These events were meticulously orchestrated, held in marketplaces, town squares, or prominent crossroads, locations chosen for maximum visibility. The gathering of crowds was both a social ritual and a demonstration of power. The spectacle served to unify the community in fear and obedience, ensuring that the reach of justice was felt by all. The instruments of death were diverse and cruel, each selected to fit the nature of the crime and the status of the condemned. Hanging was the most common method, swift yet final, often reserved for thieves and common criminals. Beheading, a more dignified death, was typically the fate of nobility, its precision a grim courtesy afforded by rank. Burning at the stake, reserved for heretics and witches, was a slow and agonizing death, intended to purify the soul through fire while terrifying onlookers with its fiery spectacle. The breaking wheel, a device designed to shatter bones and prolong agony, was a punishment for the most heinous offenses, a grotesque testament to cruelty and control. The choice of execution method was never arbitrary. It was steeped in symbolism and legal rationale. The severity of the punishment reflected the perceived gravity of the crime, while social rank influenced the manner in which death was administered. This stratification underscored the rigid class distinctions that permeated medieval society, where justice was not blind but acutely aware of status and station. The condemned, regardless of their guilt or innocence, found themselves powerless before the merciless instruments of death, their fate sealed by a system that demanded both suffering and spectacle. Among the common folk, these executions invoked a complex blend of fear, curiosity, and dark fascination. The crowds that gathered were drawn by more than mere morbid interest. They witnessed a ritual that affirmed the boundaries of acceptable behavior and the consequences of crossing them. Nobles and clergy alike understood the utility of such displays, recognizing them as a means to deter dissent and maintain order. The executioner, a figure both reviled and respected, embodied the tangible presence of authority's wrath, a human agent tasked with transforming abstract justice into physical reality. The social function of public executions extended beyond punishment. They served as a stark reminder of the fragility of life and the omnipresence of death within the medieval world. In a society riddled with disease, famine, and conflict, the spectacle of death was a constant refrain, reinforcing the precariousness of existence and the necessity of obedience. The executioner's block, the gallows, and the stake became symbols etched into the urban landscape, permanent markers of the state's dominion over life and death. Yet, beneath the surface of these public rituals lay a deeper psychological and political calculus. The authorities recognized that the spectacle of execution was as much about control as it was about justice. By making death a communal event, they harnessed collective fear to suppress rebellion and disobedience. The condemned became a warning, their suffering a message broadcast to all who might contemplate defiance. The brutality of the methods employed was intentional, designed to leave no doubt as to the consequences of criminality and dissent. The instruments of death were not merely tools, but symbols of a justice system rooted in retribution and deterrence. The executioner, often cloaked in anonymity and fear, carried out sentences with a grim efficiency that underscored the impersonal nature of medieval justice. The condemned, stripped of dignity and agency, faced their end under the watchful eyes of a society that demanded spectacle as a means of social regulation. In this crucible of fear and authority, the boundaries between law, morality, and violence blurred, revealing a justice system that was as much about power as it was about punishment. The social and political climate of medieval Europe thus forged a unique nexus where law enforcement, religious dogma, and feudal authority converged in the practice of public executions. These events were carefully choreographed dramas of death, where the condemned body was transformed into a symbol of state power and divine judgment. The public nature of these punishments ensured that justice was not only done but visibly done, reinforcing the social order through terror and spectacle. The fascination with these executions was not limited to their immediate audience. Chroniclers and historians of the time recorded the events with a mixture of horror and fascination, their accounts providing invaluable insights into the methods and meanings behind medieval justice. Eyewitness testimonies, legal records, and ecclesiastical writings reveal a complex tapestry of fear, authority, and ritualized death that defined the era. Through these sources, modern scholarship has been able to reconstruct the grim realities faced by the condemned and the societal imperatives that drove such brutal practices. In the end, the medieval execution was more than a mere act of killing. It was a performance of authority, a tangible assertion of power designed to shape the behavior of the living by the spectacle of death. The instruments of death, wielded with calculated cruelty, etched a permanent mark on the collective consciousness of medieval society, a reminder that justice was inseparable from suffering and spectacle. The shadows cast by these grim rituals continue to haunt our understanding of justice, morality, and the human capacity for cruelty. Among the myriad instruments of death that punctuated medieval justice, a handful stand out for their notoriety and the visceral horror they inspired. These execution methods were not merely acts of killing. They were carefully devised procedures that inflicted prolonged suffering, embodying the dual purposes of punishment and public spectacle. Each method bore its own ritualistic significance, its own forensic signature etched into the annals of history, revealing a grim calculus of pain designed to imprint fear and obedience upon the living. Hanging, perhaps the most ubiquitous of medieval execution methods, was deceptively straightforward, yet carried profound symbolic weight. The condemned was suspended by the neck, death ensuing from asphyxiation or, in some cases, a broken neck if the drop was sufficient. The mechanics of hanging varied, with the short drop method resulting in a slow, agonizing strangulation, while the long drop was intended to bring about a swift end by fracturing the cervical vertebrae. For common criminals, thieves, murderers, and those deemed socially expendable, hanging was both a practical and public form of death. The condemned's body, left dangling from the gallows, became a grim warning, its sight a deterrent to would-be transgressors. The forensic aftermath was brutal, the neck's delicate anatomy betrayed under the weight of the body, the airway constricted until life ebbed away, often over a protracted period marked by spasms and suffocation. Beheading, reserved primarily for nobility and those of higher social standing, was perceived as a more honorable death, yet it was no less gruesome in execution. The executioner's axe or sword was wielded with precision, a singular stroke intended to sever the head cleanly from the body. Historical accounts emphasize the skill required to perform this act swiftly. A botched beheading could prolong suffering and exacerbate the spectacle of death. Forensic analysis of surviving skulls from the period reveals the devastating force behind the blade, the jagged edges of bone and tissue bearing witness to the violent severance. The act of beheading was laden with legal and social symbolism, signifying the removal of the individual's identity and status, a final severing not only of life, but of lineage and honor. Burning at the stake was reserved for crimes that transgressed both secular and divine laws, most notably heresy and witchcraft. This method was designed to inflict maximum psychological and physical torment, the condemned bound to a wooden pyre as flames licked upward, consuming flesh and bone. The forensic consequences were horrific. Thermal destruction of tissues, carbonization of bones, and the agonizing slow death by smoke inhalation and flame. Beyond the physical agony, burning served as a potent symbol of purification, fire believed to cleanse the soul of sin even as it destroyed the body. The spectacle of a figure engulfed in flames was a terrifying moral lesson to onlookers, reinforcing the Church's authority and the dire consequences of spiritual rebellion. Perhaps the most barbaric of these methods was breaking on the wheel, a punishment reserved for the most heinous offenders, murderers, traitors, and those deemed especially dangerous. The condemned was tied to a large wooden wheel, and the executioner used an iron bar or hammer to systematically shatter the bones of the limbs. This prolonged torture could last hours, with the victim left to die slowly from shock, blood loss, or exposure. Forensic examination of skeletal remains bearing the distinctive fractures caused by this method reveals a calculated pattern of destruction. Limbs crushed in multiple places, ribs splintered, and joints dislocated. The wheel itself became a chilling symbol of cruelty and justice, a mobile instrument of death that transformed the condemned into a grotesque spectacle of suffering. Other variations of execution methods existed, each tailored to the nature of the crime and the desired message. Strangulation, drowning, and even more exotic punishments like impalement or drawing and quartering were employed in various regions and periods, each method carefully designed to maximize pain or humiliation. The forensic effects of these methods were often as brutal as their intent: compression of the airway, asphyxiation, or dismemberment, all serving to underscore the absolute power of the authorities. What united these methods was their dual function as both a means of ending life and a public demonstration of authority. Each method was chosen not only for its lethality, but for its capacity to communicate a judicial message. The physical torment inflicted upon the condemned was a language understood by all, a stark reminder that justice was both swift and merciless. The condemned, stripped of all agency, became a living embodiment of the state's wrath, their suffering a spectacle designed to imprint fear and compliance upon the witnesses. Historical records and eyewitness accounts from the period provide chilling testimonies to the suffering endured by the condemned. Chroniclers describe the slow agony of those burned alive, the terror etched into the faces of those broken upon the wheel, and the somber dignity of nobles meeting their end by the sword. These narratives, though often filtered through the biases of their authors, reveal a society intimately acquainted with death's grim theater. The forensic details embedded within these accounts, fractured bones, severed arteries, smoke-injured lungs, offer modern scholars a window into the physical realities behind the spectacle. The choice of execution method also reflected the legal and social hierarchies that governed medieval life. Nobles were spared the most degrading deaths, their executions conducted with a veneer of ritualized respect. Commoners, by contrast, were subjected to punishments that emphasized humiliation and terror, their bodies displayed as warnings to others. This stratification underscored the pervasive inequality embedded within the justice system, where death was not merely a final sentence, but a reflection of social status and power. The psychological torment endured by the condemned extended beyond the act of death itself. Many methods involved prolonged suffering, waiting hours or even days on the wheel, or the drawn-out immolation by fire, intensifying the horror for both victim and spectator. The anticipation of death, the public exposure, and the physical agony combined to create a form of punishment that transcended mere execution, transforming into a ritual of control and subjugation. Instruments of death such as the axe, the noose, the wheel, and the stake became icons of medieval justice, their presence a constant reminder of the state's capacity for violence. Executioners, often feared and marginalized, were the agents who bridged law and death, their grim duties performed under the watchful eyes of both secular lords and ecclesiastical authorities. Their skill and ruthlessness ensured that the condemned met their fate with as little error as possible, preserving the intended message of authority and deterrence. The forensic legacy of these execution methods endures in the skeletal remains and historical artifacts that survive. Analysis of bones from known execution sites reveals the telltale signs of trauma consistent with medieval punishments: blunt force injuries, cut marks from blades, and thermal damage from fire. These physical remnants provide a stark, tangible link to the suffering endured, grounding the often abstract discussions of justice in the brutal realities of flesh and bone. In this grim panorama of death, the condemned were both victims and symbols, individuals subjected to the full force of medieval justice, their bodies transformed into instruments of state power. The choice and application of execution methods reflected a society that wielded death not only as punishment, but as a means of maintaining order, instilling fear, and perpetuating hierarchical control. Each method, with its own forensic signature and social meaning, contributed to a tapestry of cruelty and power that defined the medieval justice system in all its grim complexity. In the crucible of medieval justice, religion stood as both judge and executioner, its influence permeating the very fabric of law and punishment. The Church, wielding spiritual authority with iron resolve, intertwined its dogma with the secular codes that governed society, shaping execution practices into instruments of divine retribution. Heresy and witchcraft, offenses not only against the crown but against God himself, were met with punishments designed to cleanse the soul through fire and blood. These executions transcended mere judicial necessity. They were rituals of moral reckoning and public penance, sanctified by ecclesiastical decree. The Church's role in medieval executions was multifaceted, combining theological imperatives with pragmatic governance. Religious courts adjudicated cases of heresy and blasphemy, crimes that threatened the spiritual order and, by extension, the social stability underpinned by faith. The condemned were branded as enemies of God, their punishment a necessary purgation to protect the community's salvation. The infamous trials of the Inquisition exemplify this fusion of faith and law, where accusations of heresy led to imprisonments, torture, and ultimately, execution by burning. The pyre, a ghastly altar, symbolized not merely death but the purification of sin, the flames consuming the heretic's mortal coil while ostensibly sparing the eternal soul. Beyond heresy, witchcraft trials swept through medieval Europe with chilling fervor, reflecting societal anxieties about the unseen forces believed to undermine Christian order. Women, often the targets of these accusations, faced grim fates at the stake or by other torturous means. The legal codes of the time, heavily influenced by ecclesiastical doctrine, codified these punishments, imbuing them with a veneer of sacred justice. The conflation of superstition and law created a deadly synergy, where fear and faith justified the harshest penalties, and executions became sermons in flesh and flame. The spectacle of these religiously sanctioned executions served a dual function. On one hand, they acted as moral lessons, vivid demonstrations of the consequences of straying from orthodoxy. The public nature of the punishment reinforced communal adherence to church teachings, transforming the condemned into cautionary figures whose suffering was both a warning and a call to repentance. On the other hand, these events strengthened the Church's authority, visibly manifesting its power to judge and to condemn. The spectacle of fire and blood was a deliberate display of divine wrath enacted through human hands, merging the sacred and the profane in a grim tableau of control. Secular authorities, while responsible for law enforcement, often operated in concert with ecclesiastical power, recognizing the utility of religious sanction to legitimize their rule. Executions for crimes such as treason or sedition frequently bore religious undertones, framing political dissent as heresy against the divinely ordained order. This fusion of political and religious authority allowed rulers to suppress opposition under the guise of defending both crown and creed. The condemned in such cases were not merely criminals, but symbolic enemies of the established order, their deaths reinforcing the unity of temporal and spiritual power. Notable cases throughout the medieval period illustrate how executions functioned as political tools masked in religious rhetoric. Figures accused of heresy often challenged not only church doctrine but also political authority, their punishments serving to eliminate threats and consolidate power. The public executions of such individuals were meticulously staged, their deaths transforming into spectacles that reinforced the dominance of both church and state. These events underscored the precarious balance of power, where justice was wielded as a weapon to maintain control and silence dissent. The intertwining of religious dogma and legal codes created an environment in which extreme punishments were not merely tolerated but demanded. The Church's endorsement of executions as acts of divine justice lent moral authority to what would otherwise be seen as barbaric cruelty. This theological justification masked the brutality of the methods employed, framing them as necessary purifications rather than acts of violence. The instruments of death thus became conduits of divine will, their use sanctioned by the highest spiritual powers. The ritualized nature of religious executions further emphasized their role as public penance. The condemned were often given opportunities to confess and repent, their final moments imbued with ceremony intended to reconcile the soul with God. Yet, this spiritual reprieve did little to mitigate the physical torment endured. The execution itself was a brutal climax to the penitential process, a stark reminder that forgiveness in this world came at the price of suffering and death. The psychological impact of these executions on both the condemned and the witnesses was profound. The condemned faced not only physical agony but the terror of eternal damnation, their deaths framed as a passage through sin and judgment. Witnesses, drawn from all strata of society, were compelled to confront the tangible consequences of sin and dissent, their collective fear and reverence reinforcing the Church's moral authority. The spectacle thus functioned as a communal reaffirmation of faith and obedience, a ritual of control that transcended the mere administration of justice. Executioners, often caught between secular and ecclesiastical demands, embodied the grim intersection of these forces. Their role required not only technical skill but a chilling detachment, transforming the instruments of death into agents of divine and temporal will. The social stigma attached to executioners reflected the ambivalence of a society that both feared and depended upon them, recognizing the necessity of their work while shunning their presence. In this fusion of church and state, the administration of justice became a theater of power, where executions were staged acts of theological and political affirmation. The condemned, whether heretic, witch, or traitor, were transformed into symbols of sin and rebellion, their deaths serving to purify the community and reinforce the prevailing order. The instruments of death, wielded under the sanction of both crown and altar, embodied a justice system where mercy was scarce and suffering was the price of order. Thus, medieval executions under religious auspices stand as grim monuments to an era when faith and law were inseparable, and when death was wielded as both punishment and sermon. The flames that consumed the heretic, the wheel that shattered the traitor's bones, the blade that severed the noble's head, all were instruments in a sacred drama of sin, judgment, and control. Through this lens, we glimpse a society where justice was not merely a legal concept, but a manifestation of divine will, brutal in its execution and absolute in its authority. Public executions in medieval Europe transcended the mere administration of justice. They were carefully orchestrated communal events that served to assert authority and instill societal order through the spectacle of death. The condemned body, exposed to the gaze of a gathered multitude, became an object lesson in obedience and fear, a tangible demonstration of power writ large upon flesh and bone. These events drew vast crowds, uniting communities in a shared experience of terror and control, where the boundary between punishment and performance blurred. The locations chosen for executions were deliberate, often central marketplaces or prominent crossroads where the populace naturally congregated. The arrival of the condemned was itself a procession, a grim parade that heightened anticipation and dread. Executioners prepared their instruments of death with solemn precision, while authorities ensured that the spectacle was visible from all angles, maximizing its psychological impact. The condemned, stripped of dignity and agency, was positioned at the center of this morbid theater, their suffering a public display designed to reinforce communal norms. To amplify the spectacle, authorities employed various methods that prolonged suffering and heightened horror. Severed heads were displayed on spikes or city gates, their grim visages a macabre warning to those who might contemplate transgression. Torture and mutilation often preceded death, turning the execution into a drawn-out performance of pain and submission. The breaking wheel, for example, was not merely a method of execution but a prolonged ordeal, with the condemned's limbs shattered piece by piece before death finally claimed them. Such calculated cruelty ensured that the memory of the condemned's punishment lingered long after the executioner's work was done. The psychological effect on witnesses was profound and multifaceted. The crowd's reaction ranged from horror to morbid fascination, a complex interplay of empathy, fear, and social conformity. Repeated exposure to such brutality desensitized many, normalizing violence as an intrinsic element of justice and order. Yet, beneath this veneer of acceptance lay the undercurrents of terror and submission. The spectacle of death was a stark reminder of the consequences awaiting those who defied authority. This collective experience reinforced obedience, binding the community through shared fear and the visible manifestation of power. Executioners occupied a paradoxical position within this social dynamic. As the agents who transformed legal verdicts into physical reality, they were both feared and shunned. Their role required a chilling resolve and technical precision, yet they bore the stigma of their profession, often marginalized within society despite their indispensable function. Clad in anonymity or distinctive garb, executioners became symbols of death's inevitability and the state's ruthless reach. Their presence was a constant, silent reminder that justice was not abstract but enforced through flesh and instrument. The public nature of executions also served to communicate the legitimacy of authority. By performing death in the open, rulers and church officials demonstrated their control over life and death, their power visible and unchallengeable. The spectacle was a ritual reaffirmation of hierarchy and law, a communal contract wherein the populace witnessed the consequences of disobedience. This visibility was essential. Hidden punishments could breed rumors and unrest, whereas public executions quelled dissent by making death a shared experience and a tool of social cohesion. The condemned themselves became unwilling actors in this grim performance. Stripped of their social identities, they were reduced to symbols of criminality and deviance, their bodies subjected to pain and degradation as a form of social cleansing. The physical torment they endured, whether by rope, blade, fire, or wheel, was compounded by the psychological weight of public exposure and humiliation. Their final moments were often prolonged and agonizing, a calculated cruelty designed to maximize the impact on both victim and witness. Witness testimonies and contemporary chronicles reveal the atmosphere of these public executions, the mingling of awe and dread, the cries of the condemned, the murmur of the crowd, and the solemn presence of authority figures overseeing the event. These accounts underscore the dual reality of executions as both punitive measures and communal dramas. The sensory details, sights of blood and fire, the sounds of suffering, the smell of smoke and decay, etched themselves into the collective memory, ensuring the event's function as a lasting deterrent. The psychological mechanisms at work during these events were instrumental in maintaining social order. Fear became a tool wielded by those in power, not only through the physical punishment of the condemned, but through the communal experience of witnessing such punishment. This process forged a collective consciousness steeped in obedience and submission, where the boundaries of acceptable behavior were enforced not only by law but by the ever-present threat of public retribution. The execution thus served as a nexus of power, fear, and spectacle, binding the community through shared participation in the ritual of death. Moreover, the executioner's role as both agent and symbol of death added a layer of complexity to the social fabric. Their feared presence reinforced the inevitability of justice, while their social marginalization reflected society's discomfort with the physical realities of punishment. Executioners became living embodiments of the state's monopoly on violence, necessary yet reviled figures whose actions ensured the continuation of order through death. Their anonymity and ritual garb distanced them from the populace, creating a psychological buffer between the act of killing and the society it served. The use of prolonged torture and public mutilation before death was a deliberate strategy to enhance the spectacle's psychological effect. By extending the condemned's suffering, authorities ensured that the event was etched indelibly into the minds of witnesses. The slow breaking of bones, the flickering of flames, the severed heads displayed as trophies. All these elements combined to create a sensory assault that transcended mere punishment. They were carefully calibrated acts of terror designed to communicate the futility of resistance and the absolute power of authority. In this context, public executions functioned as more than judicial sentences. They were communal rituals of control, spectacle, and social cohesion. The gathering of crowds, the calculated cruelty inflicted upon the condemned, and the visible presence of executioners and authorities created a tableau where justice was not only enacted but witnessed, experienced, and internalized. The spectacle forged a collective identity anchored in fear and obedience, ensuring that the shadow of death loomed over the daily lives of all who lived under medieval rule. Thus, the public execution was a grim choreography of suffering and power, a ritual that bound society through shared terror and spectacle. The condemned, the executioner, the authorities, and the witnesses all played roles in this dark drama, their interactions reinforcing the structures of authority and control. The legacy of these events lingers in the collective memory, a haunting reminder of the lengths to which societies have gone to impose order through the merciless instruments of death. The brutal execution methods that defined medieval Europe have left an indelible mark on the evolution of justice and human rights. Their legacy a somber testament to humanity's capacity for cruelty and the gradual awakening to mercy. As the centuries advanced, the grotesque spectacles of hanging, burning, beheading, and breaking on the wheel gave way to a slow but inexorable decline in the tolerance for such barbarity. This transformation was neither swift nor linear. It emerged from a complex interplay of social, cultural, and legal forces that challenged the very foundations of medieval punishment. The gradual abolition of cruel punishments was propelled by burgeoning philosophical and humanitarian ideals that questioned the efficacy and morality of public executions. Enlightenment thinkers began to decry the spectacle of death as a form of social control rooted in fear rather than justice. They argued for the dignity of the individual and the necessity of proportionate punishment, principles that would eventually ripple through legal reforms across Europe. The instruments of death, once symbols of unassailable authority, became relics of a darker past, their use increasingly seen as incompatible with emerging notions of human rights and the rule of law. This shift was also influenced by practical considerations. The public spectacles that once served to deter crime began to lose their power as societies evolved. The desensitization of populations, coupled with growing skepticism about the fairness of judicial processes, eroded the legitimacy of such punishments. Moreover, the rise of centralized states and bureaucratic legal systems demanded more standardized and less arbitrary forms of justice. The executioner's block and the gallows gave way to prisons and more regulated methods of capital punishment, reflecting a move toward a justice system that emphasized order and rationality over terror and spectacle. Cultural memory and folklore preserved the horrors of medieval executions, embedding them in the collective consciousness as cautionary tales and moral parables. Ballads, chronicles, and oral traditions recounted the suffering of the condemned, the cruelty of the executioner, and the spectacle of death that once dominated public life. These narratives served not only to remember but to warn, carrying the echoes of medieval justice into subsequent generations. The persistence of such stories underscores the lasting psychological impact that these executions had on society, a haunting reminder of the thin line between justice and cruelty. The lessons drawn from this dark chapter of history resonate profoundly in contemporary discussions of law and morality. The unchecked power wielded by medieval authorities, manifest in the instruments of death and the spectacle of execution, offers a stark warning about the dangers of absolute authority divorced from compassion and oversight. The evolution away from such practices highlights the importance of legal safeguards, transparency, and respect for human dignity in the administration of justice. Reflecting on the medieval execution methods forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about human nature and the societal mechanisms that enable cruelty. The condemned, once powerless against the merciless machinery of death, symbolize the vulnerability inherent in any system of justice that prioritizes retribution over rehabilitation. Their suffering, witnessed by crowds bound by fear and obedience, reveals how societies have historically navigated the tension between order and mercy, punishment and humanity. Moreover, the legacy of medieval executions challenges modern legal systems to remain vigilant against the resurgence of cruelty under new guises. The historical record serves as a sobering reminder that the veneer of civilization can thin rapidly when fear and authority overshadow justice and empathy. The instruments of death, once wielded with calculated cruelty, remind us that justice divorced from humanity risks becoming a perpetuation of suffering rather than a remedy. In contemplating these grim practices, we acknowledge the progress made toward more humane legal systems, while recognizing the fragility of that progress. The echoes of medieval executions reverberate in debates over capital punishment, torture, and the limits of state power today. They urge a continuous reflection on the principles that govern justice, the balance between deterrence and dignity, and the imperative to protect the vulnerable from the excesses of authority. Thus, the dark chapter of medieval executions, with its bloodied instruments and public spectacles, remains a powerful lens through which to examine the evolution of justice and morality. It compels us to remember the suffering inflicted in the name of law, to honor the humanity of the condemned, and to strive for a justice system that learns from the past to safeguard a more compassionate future. The shadows cast by this history are long and deep, but within them lies the enduring lesson that justice, at its core, must be tempered by mercy. If you love the story, like the video and subscribe.